Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to welcome everybody to this keynote address by the distinguished author Anne Applebaum for the YIVO Winter Program 2025. The Winter Program, as many of you know, is a program in which the YIVO Institute invites distinguished scholars from all over the a map of Jewish intellectual, cultural, religious life to talk about subjects that don't necessarily appear in standard curricula that have to do with Jewish history, Jewish memory, and so forth. And today we are very happy and we are honored and privileged to have Anne Applebaum here to speak about her new book, Autocracy Inc. That has recently been published by Doubleday. Anne Applebaum had worked for 17 years as a columnist for the Washington Post and became a staff writer at the Atlantic in January 2020. She is the author of 5 critically acclaimed and award-winning books: Twilight of Democracy, Red Famine, Iron Curtain Between East and West, and Gulag, which was the winner of the Pulitzer Prize. She divides her time between Poland, where her husband is foreign minister, and Washington, D.C. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here virtually, if not in real life.
Thank you for joining us. And your book, though short, is filled with so many important subjects that are bedeviling our world today and are filling the minds of just about every thoughtful person that I know, and especially in the YIVO community, inasmuch as so much of your book is centered on the efforts of Vladimir Putin and his octopus-like consortium of other world leaders to undermine, as you put it, the international world order. And most of us are casting about hopelessly or without great success and thinking about what do we do about this? What do we do about the subject of democracy in America, in Ukraine, throughout the world, in Israel, throughout the world? It seems to be under attack. And so I thought I would like to begin the program today with your actually reading from your book, your concluding thoughts on this subject, and then we'll go back to your analysis of the subject itself, if you don't mind.
So I'm delighted to do that, and this is, in fact, the last paragraph of the book, and I'll read it for you.
Mm-hmm.
There is no liberal world order anymore, and the aspiration to create one no longer seems real. But there are liberal societies, open and free countries that offer a better chance for people to live useful lives than closed dictatorships do. They are hardly perfect. Those that exist have deep flaws, profound divisions, and terrible historical scars. But that's all the more reason to defend and protect them. So few of them have existed across human history, so many have existed for a short time and then failed. They can be destroyed from the outside and from the inside too by division and demagogues. Or they can be saved, but only if those of us who live in them are willing to make the effort to save them.
Thank you. I think those are really important words. I wanted people to hear them. And so much of your book is precisely about how those societies are being undermined, and in such an incredible host of ways. And maybe we can begin the discussion with your just explaining what you mean by Autocracy Inc.
Mm-hmm.
and the players involved.
Right. So the thesis of the book discusses a group of dictatorships who do not share an ideology. We're talking about communist China and nationalist Russia and theocratic Iran and Bolivarian socialist Venezuela and Cuba and Belarus and a host of other countries across around the world. And they don't have a common cause. They don't have a common definition of what a good life is or what a good society is. As I said, some of them are theocratic, some of them are atheists, very different world visions. Nevertheless, they do share a few things. One of the things that they share is a dislike of the idea of checks and balances. These are all either individual leaders, or they are oligarchies, or they are political parties that seek to rule without opposition, but also without independent courts, without independent media, or with as little as possible, and without any control over what they do, without transparency, without any accountability for what they do. And they've begun in, over the past decade or two, they've begun to work together. So even countries, as I say, that didn't have any historical relationship with one another, have begun to cooperate opportunistically and transactionally when it suits them. One of the reasons they cooperate is to push back against the ideas and practices of democracy that come from both from within their own societies and from the rest of the world. So whether it's the Chinese who fighting the Hong Kong democracy movement, or the Russians fighting the Alexei Navalny's anti-corruption movement, or the Iranians fighting the women's rights movement, they understand that groups who speak about rights, or who speak about the rule of law, or who speak about accountability are a threat to their particular form of oligarchic and kleptocratic power. So they've pushed back hard against those groups, but they also understand that they're pushing back against the ideas that those groups represent. So they in different ways have sought both to poison the idea of democracy among their own people, but also to undermine democracies wherever they are in the world. I mean, this has another component as well. I mean, the Chinese see this, and the Russians also see this as a kind of great power competition. So there's a military piece of this story. There's also an economic piece that these are also all leaders and ruling elites who have partly, in some cases, have come to power, or in some cases hold power through the use of clandestine financial institutions. So the offshore world, the world of shell companies, they steal and hide money, sometimes in our financial system, in our Western system, also as a way of staying in power. So the book talks about both their use of propaganda inside, at home, and abroad, their use of military cooperation, which we see most obviously in Ukraine, but also in other places, as well as their financial cooperation, and the way they use our financial system to, as I said, steal and hide money, but also to corrupt us, and which is something we've collaborated in. And the book is actually, I'm very much keen that it not be understood as describing some kind of new Cold War. So it's not as if there's some kind of black and white division of the world, or there's a Berlin Wall with good guys on one side and bad guys on the other. It seems to me that what we're at war with as democracies, or as people who live in countries that aspire to democracy, what we're at war with is a set of autocratic practices. And those are most obviously seen in, as I said, Russia or China or Iran or North Korea, but we also have some of them at home. The same push for opacity, for concealment, for secrecy, also for the push that we see in so many countries, including our own, against independent courts, independent media. That's part of the same complex of problems. And there are good guys and bad guys on both sides of all borders. There are Democrats in Russia. I mean, not very many anymore, but there have been. There are important democratic movements in Venezuela, for example, and there's an important rights movement in Iran, or there has been. And at the same time, we have people with autocratic impulses and instincts inside the US and Europe as well. So the book is trying to describe the conflict between those different sets of ideas in a nuanced way. I suppose that's the best explanation I can give.
So in the book, you say, among other things, that one of the central things that unites these governments is the preservation of their wealth and their power. That this is like the central thing that they all converge on, the security of their wealth and their power. And what characterizes this is that it is global. Africa, Asia, the United States, throughout the world, that these actors rarely act alone anymore. And you give various examples of this throughout the book. And I wonder if you could maybe give an example, because I found your examination of Putin particularly salient and very strong. And if you could walk people through a little bit exactly the mechanism of his control and what kleptocracy really means in that context.
Right. So those are two slightly different things, but the question of how they work together and what is Putin. I mean, the book talks about where Putin comes from, and this is actually quite a well-known story, and others have written about it in great detail. I mean, it's well known to people who work and write about Russia. I don't know how well known it is generally, but Putin was obviously a KGB officer, famously in East Germany. He came back to Russia in the early 1990s. He was working in the city of St. Petersburg. And as the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, he initiated a number of swindles, that's the best way to say it, plans to take state assets, sometimes it was natural resources or companies. They were taken out of the country or sold. The money didn't go back to the state. Instead, it went to him or to one of his cutouts, to one of his associates. And what he was doing at that time was something that a lot of Russians in his generation and in his position were doing. So they were stealing money, they took it out of the country, and they laundered it through Western financial institutions, often with the help of Western lawyers or Western bankers or Western accountants, some of whom were acting legally, actually, but some of whom were acting illegally. There were around Putin, in the early years, there were a number of investigations. There was a famous one into a set of companies that he was connected to that was actually dropped by the former German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder. There was but the process was the same. We steal money that belongs to our country, and we find a way to hide it or move it around the world. And then sometimes they would bring it back into Russia, having laundered it, and then they would use the money to acquire other companies or other properties. And so these are people who came to power really from the very beginning as with the idea that what they were doing was creating a kleptocracy. So they were creating a system whereby the people who ran the state and the people who owned the state's assets were the same people. And this is what makes an oligarch. And it's, of course, important to understand in the American political context because we're beginning to have them too. But an oligarch is somebody who is, who is not just wealthy in a normal way or doesn't just run a very big company or doesn't just have political influence through but is simultaneously in politics and in business. So, you would have the owners of Gazprom would literally be working for the president of Russia. They would be the same people. So it would be as if the owners of Exxon were also running the White House, something like that. And that was the system that Putin created. And he, as I said, he did it with the help of the money laundering apparatus that was set up, around the world, including in the U.S. and by the U.S. And that system the Russians really invented the modern version of it. I mean, there's always been corruption everywhere, actually, but there's always been corruption affiliated with dictatorship. But very often, and I look at this specifically in a couple of countries, I looked at it in Venezuela, I looked at it in Zimbabwe, there was kind of traditional corruption. There would be elites who would kind of double deal to themselves, or who would control the oil resources in country X or Y. But they weren't connected to some kind of international system. Nowadays, dictators, even in smaller countries, and again, I look specifically at Zimbabwe, are able to take the money that they've earned through extortion or through theft inside their own countries, and then they're able to keep it in London. And then to use it from there to make other kinds of investments and to have influence in other countries and so on. So really the Russians created a system that others could copy and imitate, which both helped to keep a small group of people in power, but also, as I said, corrupted us, corrupted our business class, and in some cases, politicians. The Russians also had very early on a specific idea of how they would use this money. They've been interested in having clandestine political influence and economic influence for a long time. So they've used their business connections also for political reasons, and as they've also used the money that they have to try to fund political parties or to fund online information campaigns and so on. So it's had an impact on us as well. But as I said, I think what's new about it is the interconnectedness. That the oligarchs in different countries are using the same systems. They're using the same money laundering tactics, or the same often legal ways of hiding their money. Famously, London is now a city that's full of lovely houses that are empty, and it's because they're owned by foreigners who own them through shell companies or through anonymously owned companies whose identities are unclear. Periodically, their identities are revealed in some kind of leak or some kind of piece of investigative reporting, but really the city of London has been almost distorted by this. The property market is, certainly at least in central London, has been really radically changed by the number of people who use the fact that you can buy property anonymously in London as a way of hiding money. London houses become, in effect, what old-fashioned Swiss bank accounts used to be. It's a way of storing money. So that's just one illustration of the way in which this system affects Western democracies, as well as the dictatorships. I should also say one other thing about kleptocracy, which is that it's also connected to something else that is, again, Russian, but not only Russian, which is a profound sense of cynicism about democracy. I actually learned about kleptocracy, and I learned about how this all worked from the Russian opposition, who very early on, 15 years ago, began saying, there's a lot of hypocrisy in the Western world because we hear this language about human rights and democracy. And at the same time, we know that our leaders are stealing money with the help of Western bankers. They understood from the beginning that there was this contradiction, that our language wasn't matched by the behavior of our financial sector. And the Russian regime understood that as well. One of the reasons they became so cynical and instrumental in their attitude to the democratic world was because they understood that there's this gap between, as I said, the ideals and language of democracy and democratic institutions and the rule of law, and at the same time, Western institutions that are helping them steal money. And a third point maybe that's worth understanding is that some of the conflicts inside the autocratic world come from people who have revolted against the system. Actually, what's happened in Ukraine over the last 20 years is there have been two very distinct and clear moments when the Ukrainians revolted against the system, against kleptocracy, against oligarchy. The first was in 2004 and 2005. This was the so-called Orange Revolution. Then there was another version of it in 2014 when the Ukrainians protested against a profoundly corrupt president. He wound up escaping the country. And the Ukrainians have tried to create something different, something more based on the rule of law, less corrupt, more fair. And that's meant that they've come directly into conflict with the oligarchic and kleptocratic system that the Russians created and that they were imposing or supporting in other countries. So the clash between ideas about democracy and kleptocracy have already become clear in other parts of the world. I think we in the US are only beginning to understand them now.
Mm-hmm. I thought one of the most powerful things you say in the book is that these autocratic powers, whether they are communist, formerly communist, or they're theocratic, or whatever they are, they teach people to be cynical and passive because there is no better world to build. And that resonates very much, I think, here in the United States with many things that have happened during the Trump era, in fact, in which one of the typical retorts to a criticism of behavior of someone in the Trump administration is, well, the Democrats did this, or so-and-so did this. And in other words, everybody does it, and therefore there can be no standards. And it just seemed to me that what you're describing is so insidious. It's more insidious than the threat of communism was in the 1950s and 60s, it seems to me. I don't know, what do you feel the same way, or?
So it's true that the attempt to create pessimism and cynicism is an active tactic of modern dictatorships, and they do it in clear and directed ways. One way is through the use of repetitive and constant lying. So one of the differences between the old Soviet system that I wrote several books about and modern Russia is that the propaganda in the Soviet era was all about how we're creating a better world, and we're building communism, and we're building an ideal society. And the propaganda was organized to project that and explain it and glorify it. And those who are old enough will remember it, and those who are younger may have studied it. I mean, the pictures of the collective farms where they were collecting lots of grain, and the sort of tractor workers with lots of muscles and so on. And that's the world, the ideal world that we're heading towards. Modern Russian propaganda, and indeed until he fell, modern Syria propaganda or modern Venezuelan propaganda, doesn't aim for that. It doesn't try to present an ideal society. Instead, what you have is lying being used in a different way. So it's lying in a way that you're not even expected to believe it. You don't have to pretend to believe it. I mean, the famous example of this is when, if you'll remember 10 years ago, when that Malaysian plane crashed in Ukraine. It had been shot down by a Russian missile. They thought it was a Ukrainian military plane, and they brought down a passenger plane. And immediately after it happened, the Russian state came out with this extraordinary array of lies, like the plane had been full of dead bodies and it had been exploded over Ukraine to create bad publicity, or that had been shot down by some Ukrainians who were trying to shoot Putin's plane. I mean, really incredible, crazy theories about why this had happened. And they were repeated for over several days in Russia. And I remember seeing at that time, there were still Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty were still allowed to act in Russia. I remember seeing a video that was made in Moscow at around that time. And it was a series of interviews with people on the street about what had happened to the plane. And people said, not only do we not know what happened to that plane, we will never know. It's unknowable. We can't know what the truth is. There is no truth. We can't find out what it is. And that was the purpose of the repetitive lying, which was to convince people that they can't ever know what's true and what's not true because it's unknowable. And that was really the beginning of an imposition of a new level of dictatorship in Russia, is that when you rob people, if people don't know what's true, then they also don't know how to fix their society. They can't have goals for their society. They can't improve their society because everything is hidden behind a kind of fog of unclarity and, obfuscation. And, I mean, how can you improve your government if you don't even really understand what your government is? And that use of lying in that way, repetitive lying, was part of the story. The other piece of the story has been the targeted, almost sort of new level kinds of attacks on anybody who seeks to change or improve the system. The targeted hate campaigns run against individuals. Of course, this is, of course, also something that you found in Nazi Germany or in the Soviet Union. But what used to require a mob, and mass violence, you can now do using the internet. You can create online mobs that go after people and convince them that, the person who's trying to improve your country or who's trying to bring more justice, who's calling for the rule of law, that this person is corrupt, that he beats his wife, that he's involved in some kind of weird sexual shenanigans. So the attempt to smear people and blacken people's names has become much more sophisticated than it was before. The leaders of the autocracies have understood that in order to defeat a democratic opposition or even a rule of law opposition or an anti-corruption movement, they need not only it's not enough to just arrest the leaders or even kill the leaders. They need to blacken their names and undermine them so that people lose faith even in the possibility of change. They want people to think change is, the truth is unknowable and change is impossible. And once you think those things, then why would you participate in any kind of opposition? You might as well just stay home because you have no influence and you have no impact and you have no agency. And that is the real goal of modern autocracies, is to persuade people to stay out of politics and to stay home.
Mm-hmm. So it seems to me, on the one hand, you're talking about the role of social media by these autocracies in furthering disinformation and furthering the undermining of society. On the other hand, and it seems to me that what you're calling for are leaders who can articulate truths, who can articulate standards that people can believe in. And I know we have a limited amount of time, but I wonder what your thoughts are about the possibility of our finding those leaders, because in the United States right now, they seem very few and far between. And I don't know where you find them in Germany or France right now.
I mean, it's very hard for the United States is now a special case, because in the United States you now have a kind of nexus of it's social media plus podcasts plus Fox News plus all kinds of YouTubers, and there is a world now of I mean, let's call it propaganda, that inculcates a worldview that is unfortunately now becoming very rapidly anti-democratic. Certainly it's anti-rule of law, and certainly it's skeptical of checks and balances and of American institutions and of their capacity and their ability to run the country. And so it's not just a question now of finding leaders. I mean, I think there are some very articulate politicians around and others. It's a question of finding a way for them to speak that reaches people. And also an argument and a set of, I was going to say stories, but that sounds too frivolous. I mean, a set of arguments that are powerful enough to break through the propaganda. And I didn't know that we have found that yet. You have some counterexamples in other countries. You have, I mean, actually from the autocratic world, we have some examples. So Alexei Navalny, who was murdered in a Russian prison a few months ago, died in a Russian prison. One of the reasons he was so hated by Putin was that he created the one really powerful anti-Putin movement, and it was in fact an anti-corruption movement. It wasn't strictly about human rights or democracy. it was more about justice. It was about the unfairness of the system, and the outrageous excesses of the oligarchs and of Putin himself. And he was able to convey that story in a series of very high quality videos and communications. He created a movement that had bases and outlets all over the country. Was particularly strong in Siberia. He went there several times. And it was really because of the success that movement was being had that I think Putin became more violent and eventually arrested him. But but the idea behind that, behind Navalny's movement, was that he was someone who seemed authentic to ordinary Russians. He was someone who spoke in ordinary language. He found a way of communicating in a mass way. So his videos had hundreds of millions of views. And he was someone who was able to put together the dots. On the one hand, you have Putin building palaces. On the other hand, you have very bad roads and, your hospitals don't have equipment in them. And so he put together those narratives in a way that was powerful. I don't want to compare Russia to the United States. The United States has open politics and we have a political opposition, and we're not in the same circumstance. But beginning to think about, what is the way of bringing authentic information to people in a way that feels believable, and through what kind of channels we're going to do that, I think is, that's the next challenge. I suppose there's another example one can use. One can talk about, for example, I lived part of the time in Poland where we also had, not a Russian style, but a kind of autocratic populist government was in charge for 8 years, from 2015 until 2023. And it was, a political party that used this language. It assaulted the courts. It tried to politicize the courts. It sought to undermine the press and tried the Viktor Orban tactic of using the money of business people close to the government to buy media in order to make the media biased, which I think is something we're going to see in the United States as well. And so it was it was a government that sought to do all those things, and they did eventually lose an election. And again, they lost it for a couple of reasons. One was, again, because the opposition latched on partly to the corruption narrative. One of the inevitable results, when you have an administration or a political ruling party who eliminate checks and balances and the rule of law, then almost immediately you get corruption. The most corrupt country in Europe is Hungary. There's the corruption accompanies autocratic populism, and of course corruption accompanies dictatorship as well. Excuse me, I have something stuck in my throat. So the Polish opposition used that argument, which turned out to be more moving actually than arguments about democracy. But the argument about corruption, what's being stolen from you, how it's affecting your life, that was an important piece of the counter narrative. And of course, the other lesson from Poland was to do with creating new coalitions. And so the coalition that eventually won against the autocratic populists was composed of a center-left, a center-right, and a kind of center-liberal, large central liberal party. And it was really those three parties that which included people who don't agree about other things, but who agreed that it was important to reestablish the rule of law in Poland, and they eventually won the election. So being able to think in terms of big coalitions, being able to think in terms of what are the narratives that move people, and finding, in the US, the problem is going to be finding a means to transmit it. During the last election, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but the majority of people who voted for Donald Trump were people who don't ever read journalism, fact-based media. They get their information from social media or from podcasts or from YouTube. And the majority of people who voted for Kamala Harris were people who do read fact-based journalism and media. And so therefore, the people who would like to avoid autocratic populism in the US are going to have to create other forms of media that people can, that will reach people where they are. And that's a big project. There's some effort have been made in that direction, but not yet enough.
Mhm. In writing this book, did you find particular stories or situations that that you hadn't known about beforehand that particularly struck you as interesting or exemplary? You tell many different stories in the book, and so many of them are really intriguing, and I just wonder whether there were any in particular that hit you.
Well, I'm actually almost more interested in hearing your answer to the question. I mean, which of the stories did you find
Well,
you find the most interesting?
for me, the story of Zimbabwe
It's funny. I was just going to say Zimbabwe. Yes. So
that's
so
interesting.
so I have a friend, an acquaintance who was a kind of accidental democratic activist in Zimbabwe. He's a preacher. Um,
Mhm.
who kind of youth pastor is I think best way to describe it, who in some years back, almost on in a moment of desperation. So Zimbabwe is a country that has been, the economy has been utterly destroyed by a series of terrible governments. People have been, that it's profoundly corrupt. It's now very repressive. It used to be a little looser, but it's going more and more repressive. Theoretically, it has elections, but the elections are rigged, and the system feels rigged to the people who live in it. And he, in a kind of desperation, he's somebody who had traveled abroad. He came back to the country partly because his parents were there, and he was, actually having trouble just feeding his family and sending his kids to school. He couldn't make ends meet, and in a moment of desperation, he did an online video, which is very moving if you have time to see it. It's called the "This Flag" video, and he does a monologue which just came into his head about the Zimbabwean flag and what it stands for and what the colors mean and why it doesn't stand for what he wants it to be. Instead of being green and rich, the country is, people are stealing its resources. And instead of the people being the focus of the regime, instead the leaders are the focus of the regime. And this went viral in Zimbabwe, and it became a kind of movement. And people started carrying Zimbabwean flags as a sign that their patriotism and that they wanted change inside their country. And there was this brief 3 or 4 month period when it felt like he might be able to achieve some kind of change. And they got some big national debates going, and they got some conversations happening, and debates with the national bank about the economy and so on. And then the regime finally cracked down on it. And then his story then is about, he's one of the people we talked already a little bit about smear campaigns. He was the victim of that. And it's a moving story about someone who tried to change things and failed, but is still in his way, still trying. He eventually left Zimbabwe after being in prison and having his family harassed and so on. But it's a moving story.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, it was very much so for me when I read your book. Do you believe that Navalny, the memory of Navalny, is a rallying point for democratic opposition in Russia today?
I mean, right now, there's nothing. There is no democratic opposition in
There's
Russia. The people who were the leaders of what was the democratic opposition are now either in jail or they left the country. Several 100,000 people left at the beginning of the war, including, I think, everybody I know. I mean, I don't think I know any friends of mine remain in Russia. Not all of them were actual opposition leaders or movement people, but nobody I know is there anymore. So they mostly left, and that was on purpose. I think Putin wanted them to leave. So there isn't much left, but I mean, I think Navalny is hoping, or he was hoping to, and the people who are around him are hoping that he created a legacy that somebody eventually, eventually there will be a change in Russia. I mean, Putin will not live forever. At the moment when anything happens to him, when he drops dead for any reason, because he's slipped on a banana peel or fallen down the stairs, whatever, then there will immediately be a crisis because there's no succession process in Russia. And because not only is it not clear who would follow Putin, it's not clear how that person will be chosen. And so there will be a crisis. And Navalny's theory was always that at that moment of crisis, he would emerge or someone around him would emerge and begin to speak. And that it's not impossible that lurking below the surface are people who would do that. I think right now the best we could hope for in Russia would just be simply, a government that wasn't toxically anti-Western and wasn't imperialist. I would settle for that, because the crisis in Russia is caused both by Putin's insistence that Ukraine is not a country, that it belongs to him, and by his desire to upend what remains of American influence and Western rule of law. So what he wants to show in his war in Ukraine is that borders don't matter, human rights don't matter, the UN Charter doesn't matter, the Geneva Conventions don't matter. I can do whatever I want. I can kidnap children, I can bomb cities, I can destroy a dam and flood the countryside, and I will pay no price for it. And that's one of his goals in Ukraine has been that. And that's a big goal. That's about showing that there is no such thing as rule of law and none of it is real. And simply having a leader of Russia whose primary goal was creating prosperity in Russia, that would be a big improvement.
Yeah. My last question. You make use of this term that is fairly current, called multipolarity, the new multipolarity. So why don't you explain a little bit about that? Because it's a fascinating concept, actually. There is no center any longer. That is part of the destruction of liberal democracy is also the idea of the destruction of the center.
So the problem with the word multipolarity is that it has two meanings. And one meaning is the one that you just used, which is simply the idea that there are many sources of power in the world, that the United States is not the only country or even the most important country to have influence. That there's the US and Russia and China, but there's also Brazil and India and Turkey, and there are the United Arab Emirates, and that all these countries have influence and they have power. And that's simply a fact. That's just a description of reality, that we live in a world where there are many powers, and so I don't have any problem with the use of the word that way. In addition to that, the autocratic world also uses that word to mean something else. And they mean specifically what I was talking about before. So specifically the end of any notion of the rule of law, of any primacy for the idea of human rights. The idea of human rights is actually written into almost every single international institution, the UN, not just the Western ones, not just the European Union and so on, but also, the Organization of the American States and, the African Union. Almost all of them have some language about rights or dignity or in their founding documents. And the goal of the autocratic world is to take that language out. And then, by the way, the Chinese are very interested in this, in removing human rights and the language of human rights from the UN, from the world of international institutions, from debate. And they want to replace it with multipolarity. So, or sometimes they use the word sovereignty. And by sovereignty, they mean we get to decide what happens inside our own country and it's nobody else's business. So if we want to lock up the Uyghurs and keep them in concentration camps, and separate Uyghur children from their parents or Tibetan children from their parents, there was recently a big report about that. Nobody can criticize us or stop us, and nobody has the right to say anything. And that's sometimes how they use that word too. So their idea is a world in which there is no such thing as universal rights. There is no such thing as common humanity. There's no special respect for borders, and we can do whatever we want. And when they say multipolarity, that is actually what they mean. So it's not just a description of reality. It's also an aspiration to have different rules.
Mm-hmm. And I guess, and I'd like to hear your thought and this will be absolutely the end. It seems to me that that these regimes are posing a kind of threat of radical relativism against any kind of universalism. And you just spoke about this, or any kind of absolute values, set of absolute values.
It's radical relativism and it's impunity. There aren't any rules.
Yeah.
We don't pay any price. We can kill who we want, arrest who we want, do whatever damage we want, and you can't stop us. And you have no ability to control us. And that desire for absolute power is, of course, the international version of their desire for absolute control at home. And so we don't want to have any constrictions. We don't want to owe anyone anything. And that's, I mean, it's not totally different from the dictatorships of the past. It's just that I think we're not used to seeing that phenomenon in so many different ideologies. We're used to thinking of it as Soviet communism or Nazism, but actually there are many versions of it, and to a greater or lesser degree. And then, as I said, the big story is these countries beginning to work together. So sharing common means of doing propaganda, cooperating militarily with the Iranians and North Koreans helping directly in Ukraine, the Chinese helping indirectly, cooperating at the level of international institutions and in other places. And so that's the big change. I mean, although if we're ending, let me also point out that there's nothing inevitable about these regimes and no rule that says they have to win. We've just witnessed the end of the Syrian regime, which happened with incredible speed, because once the people who guarded the regime, the secret police and the army, lost faith in the leadership, and once the leadership lost its support, from Syria, was actually a kind of example of what I'm talking about, that it was a regime that was kept going by its allies in Russia and China, Russia and Iran. And once they lost that, the supporters of the regime fell away instantly. I mean, they just, the reason why the Syrian rebels won wasn't because they were military geniuses, but because the government gave up. And that kind of rapid change you could imagine other places. And there's also this inherent fragility that many of these regimes have that I've already described in Russia, which is that if you don't have a succession process, if you don't have a way to choose a legitimate leader, then whenever there's a change of power, then there's a crisis. And that you can anticipate in other places too.
Well, I think we should end here on this optimistic note, or semi-optimistic note. And thank you again and so much for joining us for this winter keynote address. And thank you all for watching today.
Thank you so much for your time and attention, and I wish you, an excellent semester and an excellent week. Thank you.